Here. I wanted to bring towards the end of this video a feeling of being there. So let's get the audio recording on. So as you're traveling on this gondola, you're exposed to the chatter in multiple languages of what the day has just consisted of and will consist of for the next few hours, and where the best beer is to be found, where the best meal is to be had. And in a way, I was tempted when I was writing about these things to sort of make the distinction between these area mobilities and an on-the-ground experience of the place, to make the distinction between a place and a non-place, like Marc Auger has written about non-place. But I was actually quite, upon reflection, against that idea because, first of all, it sets another binary opposition and it promotes the alleged authenticity of one place or another. But what was more interesting to me is that these places, these infrastructures, these gondolas are very much part of the environment. And that's why when the artist Hubert Kostner talked about it, I decided to keep it in the version of the final cut, because he himself argues that it's part of the place. He appreciates these mobilities because they've always been there. They're part of, he says, they're part of my inner child. And as someone who spent quite a bit of time as a tourist in those areas as a child, they are part of the experience. They're very much inseparable from it. And yes, it is true that stepping on one of those gondolas and chairlifts is the same as stepping on a boardwalk or stepping on a cruise ship, but it's also part of the place. It's inseparable from it.
Okay, so maybe my connection doesn't quite make sense in your eyes, but when it came to the discussion of the tipi, I was also like, for me, this created a kind of parallel, because I was thinking you are experiencing the outside according to whatever idea of the outside you have, but you kind of also claim the space because it is your own. Like you are letting in as much as you can, especially with a tent that you can literally see the invaders and fight the insects or whatever.
Yeah.
So you're exposing yourself to exactly the degree of wilderness that you are.
That you're willing to take. Absolutely. No, I agree with you on that point. And as a matter of fact, you're also using it to isolate yourself from fatigue, for example, from inconvenience, and you are able to use it as a vessel to see more. To go up this particular cliff would have taken several hours, and it would have been challenging at best for most of us. So it has those functions as well. You're right. That's also a good point. Yes?
I'm from the U.S., so I used to do a lot of trekking and walking. So I was kind of used to this notion of leave no trace, or
right.
Take only photos, leave only footprints, right? That
yeah.
thing. But then I went and did some backpacking in South America, and it was very different. There was, fortress wilderness really wasn't the case there, at least, especially in the Andean countries. So herding is just kind of everywhere. There's huts and even villages sometimes. And then coming to the UK, also, in Britain, it seems like there's often sheep herding going on, in most wilderness places that I've been to.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just kind of wondering, is it different notions of wilderness?
Yes.
Where does this notion of wilderness come?
Yes.
Is the notion of wilderness itself moving and entangled in these kind of neoliberal?
Absolutely, 100%. Yes, and that's pretty much right at the core of the research design, to go to a variety of places, very different from one another in many ways. to really dissect what wild might mean in a local context, because like you living in Canada, I'm exposed to a completely different kind of wilderness than this. And I'm going to Japan next. So those ideas imply radically different conservation politics and radically different economic schemes surrounding its quote-unquote exploitation. Yeah, so it's very much a part of it. This is why I joked at the very beginning of the presentation. I said, I hope you don't ask me to define it. Because, to define it would be a disservice to the diversity of the idea and the very fact that I'm still, collecting data. And my job is really not to define it, but to collect as many definitions of it as possible, and hopefully as different as possible from one another. I could joke that the most hardcore definition of wilderness is to be found in New Zealand, but I leave that for a different discussion. But it depends. My point is, depends on who you ask. Yeah, very much. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question, because it's striking for me to see these images from Italian mountains at the same time. In this very moment, on those mountains, there are people who are dying trying to cross the border on foot. So the migrants who try to reach Austria.
Oh, right, that's what you're referring to. Yes,
yeah.
I thought you.
And also on the Western Alps, those who try to reach France, they are now forced to pass the mountains in this way because the border is blocked, basically, so it's impossible to cross by train or even with the smuggler. And so I was wondering, how do you articulate if there is an engagement in your work with these uneven mobilities and the fact that the environment itself can become very much an obstacle, so that is used on purpose also in many frontiers to not to block but to trouble migrants' journeys and to make them extremely hard, up to the point that they risk their lives not only at sea but even in the mountains. So apart from the fact that these places, as you said, are more and more for rich tourists, but also there are other. So and the vehicles in themselves can be appropriated and used strategically in very symmetrical way. Like I have in mind the literature that is now around this concept of via politics. So how the vessels as well are used and appropriated by migrants, but obviously from a very different position.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Martina. And so your question is very much whether wilderness is a barrier. And indeed it is. I don't have any examples from my research that relate directly to what you mentioned, but I have a bit of an opposite example that still gets at the point that wilderness is a barrier. So the very last trip that I took was to Wood Buffalo National Park. Has anyone heard of Wood Buffalo National Park? Okay, some of you has. It's Canada's largest park, the second largest national park in the world. I think the size of it is something like twice the size of Switzerland, something like that. Only 3,000 people visit it, but it's really not the point of how many people visit it. The point is that it sits downstream on the Athabasca River. And if you know anything about North American geographies, the Athabasca River is essentially the body of water that the Canadian tar sands are utilizing to clean bitumen with. So, of course, we're talking about the province of Alberta, which is really rich in bitumen resources, the oil basket of North America, if you will. And what is being used is the same water, the Athabasca River, that is used downstream by a very remote First Nation community that hasn't moved from that community for time immemorial, and now they're suffering because of pollution and reduction in water levels. And in this particular case, wilderness is a barrier because no one knows about it. They are so remote, they are so far away, they are so small in a sea of a land that is much bigger than them. Their plight essentially is falling on deaf ears. And their unwillingness to move, rightfully so, is in a way the opposite of that migration that you're referring to. It's the unwillingness to move. And the fact that they are stuck in such a wilderness is what is creating an uneven mobility type scenario. So it's really the opposite in a way, but it's really the same point. Yeah. Yes. I don't know who was first. Like whoever. I don't know.
Me?
Okay.
Sorry for coming late. I had a student with a crisis, but once so if you've answered this already, apologize.
It's okay.
But I'm kind of curious about the creative process actually of making and editing.
Oh, cool.
Like
Sure.
Because there's a lot of pressure on us all now to do more creative forms of intervention, public engagement,
Right.
this kind of stuff. So I'm wondering, who is this for?
Yes.
Right? But also some of the kind of conceptual issues that surround it, because to me there's some nice moments. I wonder how much you thought about how you film a wilderness landscape in terms of the sublime, the aesthetics of the sublime,
yes.
and how much you play into that, because there are clearly moments where you play into that.
For sure.
And there's all, the extent to which you're challenging that through the narratives that you're constructing. So I was wondering if you could talk. There are some moments where it juxtaposes really nicely.
In a way, you've answered my question.
But I'm just curious.
But here's my answer. More, those are the types of questions that I enjoy the most these days, because I tend to be quite geeky about these things. Okay, so the first question was, who is this for? Okay, so there's multiple components to my answer. The two videos that I've shown were actually put together to accompany two separate papers. So one was a paper that is going to come out in Space and Culture, the one in Australia, and the second one is a paper that is currently under review. So it's an effort that I'm making to combine writing with video within a journal issue. So I've done this in the past as well. For example, in the journal Mobilities, recently I've submitted an article and the video is part of the same issue. My point is that more and more, most of us read articles exclusively online through PDFs, but yet we don't make use of the multimodal capacity of PDF. And so I've been asking journal editors to allow for their journals to become more multimodal, and more they're saying, yeah, great. So actually it's sort of like an invitation to all of you. Do try. It's a lot of fun, and it brings a different element to the research that words are not capable of describing. So that's part of my answer. The second part of my answer is that these are, like I admitted, hastily put together for the sake of accompanying a paper, but the much bigger intent is to succumb to those pressures myself, because my university has made it very clear that they're happy to send me to all these beautiful places around the world, as long as I will have a massive audience that will splatter the university logo all over the world. I'm being cheeky about it. But the point is that I really do believe in the value of public geographies, and I've done films before that have reached literally audiences in the millions of people, which I think as a geographer is very valuable, because I can share my knowledge with a much greater audience. So my answer now becomes one of which audience do I have in mind and how do I communicate with it. So when it comes to creating a short video for a journal for a journal article, my editorial choices are pretty much in sync with the conceptual message that I'm making in the paper. So I'm using images almost as evidence, as empirical data, as material that I can then conceptualize, just like I would with journal field notes. And so it's a very laissez-faire, if you will, style of editing. And I'm just showing you the things that I'm writing about. When it comes to the other project, the one that will be distributed differently to a much larger audience, then I will make choices that are different. I will try to seduce the viewer into at first viewing these images of the sublime in the accepted normal manner, but then I will turn the camera around. So it's almost like if you go to If you watch a documentary about the Galapagos, you will see sea lions, you will see turtles, you will see all these beautiful species. And that is really what I want to do at first. But then I want to turn that camera 180 degrees and show you the ecotourists that are taking pictures, and the boat that is just waiting for you on the other side, and the guy that is making sure that you don't step outside the trail. And so that is really what I want to achieve with that type of product.
To some extent, you have to be complicit in the neoliberal construction of wilderness.
I have to begin from it,
Yeah.
because it's what will allow people to recognize these places as such. If I didn't, they would probably turn away within the first 30 seconds. Yeah. It's a very good question. Thank you for that. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting. I was just, while you were talking, I was thinking about that essay by William Cronin, The Trouble with Wilderness.
Yes.
And I was thinking, like, how do you see that, because that, I think, is like written 20 years ago.
Yeah,
that
1996.
has evolved, and I was wondering how you think that argument about wilderness not really being wilderness how it's different in the context of neoliberalism,
Well,
and ecotourism, whether those arguments have shifted.
They have shifted a bit. Cronin was accused by just about everyone in the world for being sacrilegious, for casting doubts on the sacred idea of wilderness in a way that he himself did not expect. But there's been a shift away from that, and especially in the United States, where wilderness has a very contentious history, there's been a shift at a higher level, higher political, environmental level, where there is more and more conviction in the fact that wilderness is indeed a constructed idea, but it is still an idea worth preserving. And so if you speak to ecologists nowadays, they too have recognized the fact that yes, wilderness is a constructed idea, but in order to preserve it, we must be complicit in its constant reconstruction. And so we must aid nature along. And one of the manifestations that you have here in Europe of that new form of understanding wilderness is in the rewilding movement, which is really, really strong in Europe, especially in the UK. It recognizes the fact that wilderness is valuable, that wild places are valuable, but they're not pristine and untouched. They are very much touched, and it's through our touch that they can be preserved and appreciated for generations to come. So that is probably where we are right now. Yeah. I know you've been waiting for a while.
Well, no, you answered my question about rewilding, so that's fine.
Okay, that's fine.
Is that therefore what you meant when you talk about New Zealand, sort of predator eradication stuff?
Yes, part of it, but that's actually quite a very strong theme, sort of like purifying the wilderness from foreign species. But what was interesting to me in New Zealand was also a very unique interlinking of the notion of wilderness with the notion of national identity. I wasn't in New Zealand long enough to delve into this too much, but the people that I spoke to made it very clear that to be a Kiwi is to be a lover of the outdoors and to be prepared to be in the outdoors in a way that is much more, shall I say, intense than anywhere else in the world that I've been. Places that in New Zealand I found, I'm from British Columbia, places in New Zealand I found to be incredibly raw and harsh and remote were dismissed by the average Kiwi as being nothing but fanfare for the average tourist. And yet I was clinging for my life from trees, for crying out loud. But yeah, that to me was very fascinating how in New Zealand there was also a link with notions of masculinity as well. A fascinating place that I would just absolutely love to go back. And then of course there is the Aboriginal component as well. I like I said, I very loosely called upon New Zealand as being the epitome of the authentic ideology of wilderness. but in a much more complex way than it may seem. So, are you from New Zealand, or have you been to New Zealand?
I've done some work on this sort of stuff.
Oh.
A long time ago.
Okay.
Maybe they've just gone off what you told me.
Oh, okay. Brilliant. Thank you. Cool.
Nice. The discussion is parallel. What do you say? Yeah.
Sure. So you talk about money being a little bit of a barrier for getting to some places, or maybe it enables it. Or what did you think about Canada giving away free national parks passes this year? Because the front country got hammered in those mountain parks.
Well, it was actually a common subject with Parks Canada representatives, because whenever I go to a World Heritage Site, chances are it's a Parks Canada site as well. Not always, but often. And so that conversation this year has come up with several Parks Canada agents, and they hated the idea because it brought so much business to their lives. And it made, in some cases, park sites as being overrun. Banff, for example, was just an absolute circus. But on the other hand, people that I spoke to, Parks Canada people that I spoke to, that had a much better perspective on it than I did, because I'm a misanthrope, and But they were saying at the same time how great of an idea it was, because it gave the opportunity to people to visit these sites that otherwise would not have taken it. It gave access to people who could not afford it necessarily, even though it's a small fee. It allowed for families, for example, to spend more time. And just to give more context to this, to the rest of the audience, it was the 150th birthday of not quite Canada, but colonial Canada, and as a result, it was decided that for this year, 2017, access to all national parks would be free of charge this year, and this year only, which has brought an incredible amount of tourists to these parks. But here's the thing, and again, I must put it in context. For some sites like Banff, it's obvious that you have not just a few thousands, but several thousands of people on any given day. For other parks, they are so remote and so large that the difference between having 300 people in a day and 500 people in a day is non-detectable anyway. So I think it was a good idea. To some degree, it was a good idea, except for Banff. Maybe they should have just said that.
Shall I kind of stop the conversation at this stage again?
You're in charge.
The actual very interesting topic you raised was about the sort of the different visions of wilderness, and you used New Zealand as an example. Our next speaker is going to be from New Zealand, so we can have a chance to see to what extent he agrees with your definitions or not. He can tell us, as a real Kiwi, he can tell us whether it is a real wilderness or not, although he's going to be talking about issues of emotions, migration and labour, so three kind of topics, so slightly different thing. But just want to use the opportunity to say thank you to our speaker, and thank you for handling the questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much.